share common experiences with anybody who's sort of gotten in, who's stepped up and spoken out. It's risky, it's scary, it's lonely. And if something inside makes you, like me, feel compelled that you have to do this, this is the right thing to do, and somebody has to name the issue and, as you say, speak truth to power and hope that you break down some barriers and make it easier for others to speak up.
Hello. Today I chat with Freada Kapor Klein, who is this amazing woman who has been at the forefront of diversity in the tech industry for many decades. And she just wrote this great book called Closing the Equity Gap, which is about a bunch of founders who are building at the frontier, and they're like, at the frontier of disadvantaged communities. And so they're like from these places and they're building for these places. And it just shows how much, juicy frontier there is around these, traditionally disadvantaged folks. It makes me think of, seatbelts and how they were just made for dudes in like the 1970s or whatever. And it was like, oh, all the women were dying. Well, that's because the dudes weren't thinking about it, And so there's a similar like arbitrage opportunity here. And so Freada and I, we chat about kind of three big topics. One of them is the frontiers of, cultural fabric that she's been on, and I think that started with, sexual harassment. And for her, it was before it was illegal. This is 1976. She's been expert testimony for all these things. It's like how to move the needle around the conversation around a cultural fabric, like, oh, sexual harassment's fine in the workplace, blah, 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 and then applying that to her current cultural frontier of how do we, dispel these myths around investing in, marginalized groups, and that is, those are myths, their firm has been super successful. And so we kind of chat about how to kind of nudge cultural fabrics and these having her been at these, frontiers for a long time, what that looks like. So that's kind of one piece. The second is, this amazing filter she has around gap closing versus gap widening. And so a gap closing activity is something like an $8 a month tutoring program. Well, a gap widening activity is like a $300 a month, $300 an hour kind of private tutor. And so if you have that lens on in your life, you get to ignore the things that are gap widening, and you get to like work for the things that are gap closing, and that's a really helpful lens. And then finally, third, we talk about this other lens, which is the distance traveled lens, which is instead of looking at someone as, they went to Stanford, boom, they're great. Instead, you look at where they came from and where they are now, and if that distance traveled is large. And this is like the classic, like, don't hire someone for y-intercept, hire someone for the slope of their x-axis, or the slope of the line. That's what you want to be doing. And so that distance traveled lens is a great way to kind of, again, view the world and be like, whoa, here's this person, where'd they come from, where are they now? Oh wow, it's a massive distance traveled. They're going to be an awesome, an agentic human being. So those are the three big things we chat about. It's a good conversation, and I hope you enjoy learning about these gap closing and distance traveled activities. Thanks. Hello, Rhys's Pieces. I'm Rhys, the founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. I believe the best way to predict the future is to build it. And so I'm interviewing pioneers on the frontier to understand what the world will look like and the secrets behind how they're building it. These are insights from the frontier. And today, I'm excited to chat with Freada Kapor Klein. Freada was a founder of the Kapor Center and Kapor Capital, has been at the forefront of diversity in tech for many decades, and recently wrote a book on closing the equity gap. Freada, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Rhys. Thank you.
Yeah, excited to dive in. And Freada's one of those amazing people where you're like, as you kind of pill yourself into the diversity in tech world, and you're like, oh, Project Include is cool, and All In is cool, and all this stuff. Oh, wow, what happened with all the Me Too and tech stuff? It's like, oh, Freada was like there for all this stuff.
Well, that's the bright side of being old. I've been around a long time.
But that's great. And it's cool. It's cool too for like when young people listen to stuff and they're like, wow, all these old people have done more. It's like, yeah, you're like 22. You're like, you'll have time, So don't worry.
Exactly.
So I want to dive into, trying to understand, the frontier of this tech gap. And I think actually thinking of it, I was actually thinking about this before the show myself, which is like, Thinking of it like a frontier, I think is correct. There are these like artificial intelligence frontiers or cryptocurrency frontiers or whatever, where it's like the tech frontiers there. But this is a cultural frontier where we have our current status quo, which is kind of dumb, of just like rich white dudes just like continuing to like accumulate power and wealth. But there's this frontier where we're trying to push into this new crazy world, where there are where traditionally marginalized groups are a bigger part of these wealth creation events. So that's kind of the macro frame. And I guess before doing anything, I guess, Freada, I just want to know from you, like, how did you get into this stuff? Why did you like, quote unquote, dedicate your life to like helping, marginalized groups within technology?
Well, going way back, I've sort of always had a social and racial justice lens. So I used to cut middle school and go picket for the farm workers. And I make sure that I don't tell that. We've been running a summer math and science honors academy for low income high school kids of color. And I try not to tell them that story because I'm a terrible role model if you look at that. But, and I then, given the era I grew up in, there was a Black Panther Party and a civil rights movement. There was a resurging feminist movement. There was an anti-war movement. So there were social and racial justice issues all around that really helped form me as a teen and young adult. So I went on, I co-founded the first group on sexual harassment in 1976, before it was even illegal. And so sort of grew up with that issue. And that opened all these other doors to me. So that's when I began to understand a lot about how organizations work, how corporations work, how do you address social and racial justice issues in the context of business. And so just you can see the evolution. And as I was looking more and more to where the centers of power are and how do you change those, that's what got me interested in on the investing side. But I did a PhD in social policy and research, dissertation on sexual harassment, and my first job out of graduate school was at Lotus Development Corporation, the spreadsheet 123, Lotus Notes. So I was deep in the tech of the moment. And my job description was to make Lotus the most progressive employer in the US. So how can you turn that down? And I have never seen that job description since, which is really sad, because I think we need more CEOs, more founders to embrace what can be, as you say, what can be the frontier of building organizational culture.
Yeah, I love that. It's a cool. Well, hey, it also makes me think of like how the Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, and she tells the story of being in her Harvard law school class, and it was just like, and all the like the men there, all the boys were just like, you don't deserve to be. They were just like saying all these like awful things to her, and it was just like, oh my god. And so, thinking about that in the context, and like for you, like doing sexual harassment stuff, and being like, hey, this is actually an issue, people, and we can't have this. I'm curious for you personally. When someone speaks truth to power, the power people don't like it. Have you had any like intense, or how have you dealt with people being like, "Shut up, Freada," or like, "Hey, don't talk about that," or like, what has that been like for you? What have been some of the more intense moments with that?
Well, it's a great question, and I think I share common experiences with anybody who's sort of gotten in, who's stepped up and spoken out. It's risky, it's scary, it's lonely. And if something inside makes you, like me, feel compelled that you have to do this, this is the right thing to do, and somebody has to name the issue and, as you say, speak truth to power and hope that you break down some barriers and make it easier for others to speak up. So that was true way back, talking about sexual harassment, when nobody wanted to hear about it. And I was an expert witness for a couple decades in many lawsuits, trying to change sort of what employers were expected to do. But that's a little bit what carries over to what goes on now in investing. there is a very common myth. There were many myths about sexual harassment, some of which still persist. There are many myths about investing, including that investing for impact or investing with the diversity lens is quote unquote concessionary, meaning that you give up financial returns if you focus on impact and or diversity. And we've proven otherwise. And so, one by one, we try to shoot down these myths and give positive examples of change.
Yeah, I like that. It's a it's a tough thing with, as you're, these, just like the water we swim in for something like the sexual harassment world, where it's like, it's normal for dudes to just, I don't know, to like be like kind of sketchy people in the office. It's like, and it's like, wait a second, like that shouldn't be true. And here's the impacts of it and blah, blah, blah. And so you have to kind of pull everybody into a new kind of cultural fabric that exists. And similarly within tech investing, it's like, oh, maybe we'll kind of, maybe we, have the allocation of our portfolio for diverse folk, but like, no, it's like what you guys, you guys had 29% IRR, and internal rate of return for these, for your portfolio, which is like in the top quartile or whatever. And so it's like, yeah, you can make money by doing good. And because there's so much, especially because, our society, there's people have been neglected for a long time. So there's a lot of like value, a lot of like easy and hard value to get there. Let's kind of start with that for a second then, which is how, in your book, you do a great job of showing a bunch of these examples of companies that are just building great things that are with traditionally marginalized founders, women, BIPOC folks, and that they're working also with often traditionally marginalized or BIPOC folks. What how I guess what's my question here? Tell us about what it's like to what kind of unique frame those folks have on the world, and how that allows you to have these outsized returns.
Great question. And we have honed in on a very specific definition of impact. Because in this day and age, impact means all things to all people. And it gets very confusing if you're trying to invest for impact. Well, do you want to impact climate change? Do you want to impact racial wealth gaps? Do you want to impact homelessness and unhoused? Food insecurity? Unfortunately, there's an enormous number of social problems that need solving. Many, not all, many can benefit from private market solutions if you've got the right founders, the right backers, the right framing. So we honed in 2011 on a very specific set of investment criteria. So we only invest in tech startups, and that is because we believe that tech is the only thing that gives you scale. And scale is what you need to solve big, intractable social problems. So all of the tech startups we invest in, the core business has to close gaps of access or opportunity or outcome for low-income communities and or communities of color. And so it's not a Tom Shoes model where you buy one, give one away. It's not after we're profitable, we're going to set up a foundation. It is inextricably linked to the business itself. The core business has to tackle these gaps. And so that makes it much harder to say, oh, well, times are rough, take impact out of your purpose. So that's been our focus, 100% investing in gap closing businesses since 2011. And as you said, top quartile returns, not just for diversity funds, not just for impact funds, top quartile when we're put up against mainstream VC firms of our size and vintage that only sought out to make money. Those who were just looking to make money, we beat 75% of them.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of like a classic thing too, where it's like when you're hiring folks, the way I think about it is you just have to, you're not lowering your bar. What you're doing is you're just increasing your aperture, and you're thinking, okay, let's like make our pipeline bigger, and then let's like just try to have it, and let's actually track it and see, like how many people. And then when you do that, it's not like then come in these, like, if you're looking, I don't know, some engineer, it's not like, oh, here's this woman who's like, oh, she's so much worse, but we still have to take her. It's like, no, you just had to look. And so that's been my rough, when I'm hiring and stuff, that's kind of the energy. And so it's cool to hear. So, but I have a question for you, which is, I think one of my first startups was one that was like helping low-income kids make music. And it was hard to, like, low-income kids don't have much money. And so, blah, blah, blah. And so we had to constantly move up market, all these weird things. So how do you, that kind of energy, it's like, maybe I give an example or something, like, how can one make money helping lower income folks when the lower income folks don't even have money in the first place or whatever,
It's a great question, and that barrier stops a lot of entrepreneurs. And again, I want to say there are some social issues that require public funding or philanthropic funding, that the private market can't solve everything. And it's important to understand the limits of venture capital or
and which
any
ones,
other.
yeah, tell us about which ones are good for private versus which ones are good for philanthropic.
Well, what's interesting is that there are things in every sector that fall into both buckets. So we have invested, for instance, in ed tech companies that are gap closing, but you will also see an awful lot of gap widening ed tech companies out there. And let me just give you a couple of examples, and we can stick to one theme, which is tutoring. So it's possible to spend $300 an hour to get your kid tutored. That is a gap widening business because only people who can afford $300 an hour can use that service. And so the gap between kids who have that kind of help and those who don't just widens things. So we would never, no matter how great the quality of tutoring, we just wouldn't invest in that. We do invest in a company called Numerade that has answers, video answers to basically every textbook problem there is. And they're actually a really great example of leveraging AI to very quickly deploy more and more. What's their cost? $8 a month, right? And so $8 a month is accessible for lots and lots and lots of people. And if for some reason that $8 a month isn't accessible, that's an easy amount of money for a school district, a city, a community, a philanthropy to pick up, so that you're not going to ever have that being a gap widening kind of business. And there are similar examples. There's health tech, digital health. There's concierge medicine where you can pay thousands of dollars a year just to join a practice. And there's also digital health that is focusing on the crisis in maternal health, especially for Black women.
Cool. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And so it's what I'm hearing is that there's for the listeners, it's like, yeah, this great frame that Freada has around gap widening versus gap closing is just a very helpful thing where you look at something and at those examples, it's very clear, like, oh, here's this like random app that just like helps rich people make more money. It's like, that's pretty gap widening versus like, oh, here's this thing that like is actively helping like provide more opportunity to poorer folks or whatever. It's like, oh, that seems like a gap closing one. So that's kind of, that little frame is helpful. And I think and what I'm hearing is that it's kind of in many ways, it's a cost of the service, where it's like if something costs less, then that thing can be a gap closing activity. Is that roughly what I'm hearing? Is that one of the key things?
That's part of it. So part of it is the overall cost, indeed. But you've got to, with a very low cost, you've got to maintain a very high quality. So it's what does the product or service deliver? But it's also, as you were hinting at, we look very closely at, if this business succeed, who benefits? Who does it help? And one of the interesting things, like $8 a month tutoring, it helps everybody. That family that was going to pay $300 an hour, they have a whole lot more disposable income now that hopefully they'll do something good with it. But at any rate, it's not like an $8 a month tutoring company hurts anyone. Mm-hmm. And so while we focus on closing the gap, most of the companies have services that also help other folks, help everybody, that helps businesses. I mean, one of my favorite examples of a company in our portfolio that many, many mainstream venture capitalists passed is Bitwise Industries. They're based in Fresno, California, not the usual place you go look for the hot startup. Two Latinx co-founders, Jake and Irma. And they are the largest supplier of tech apprentices in the country. They're in 10 cities and growing. They're making a lot of money, and they're transforming thousands of lives directly as the apprentices, and tens of thousands by their families, and hundreds of thousands by their communities.
Yeah, I think that those examples, them, career karma, some of the stuff that you guys do with your the STEM high school STEM program for
Uh-huh.
folks, those are just those ones are so clearly like good answers too, which is like, look, it's like if you have these people who are here where, opportunity, talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. If you can somehow, there's essentially a lever, an arbitrage opportunity there where if you
Mhm.
find the folks who can be awesome apprentices, boom, they come through the tech system, they go through whatever system, they get upskilled, and then they're making a lot more money. And if they're making
Right.
more money, well, then you can make more money as a business. And so I think those like education ones
Mhm.
are a really clear and easy one. Let me ask you about this ecosystem as a whole, though, which I think is kind of interesting, which is that you guys have like, the Kapor Capital, but also the Kapor Center.
Uh-huh.
And so it's like, and I think some of the best people, I'm reminded of some of the folks in the psychedelics industry that like are a VC firm that then give, 50% of their carry back to MAPS and these other kinds of psychedelic agencies that are like researching the future of psychedelics or
Uh-huh.
whatever. And there's like a similar-ish thing with like the Kapor Capital and Kapor Center. Tell us about like the center and like some of the research that you guys are doing, whether that is that actually a feedback loop between those two things, or what's going on there?
Feedback loop is a great descriptor. There is very close integration. So Kapor Capital, Kapor Center, and SMASH. SMASH is the nonprofit Summer Math and Science Honors Academy. This is its 20th year, and on 10 university campuses. But all three, very importantly, were all housed together. And so not, now this COVID, post-COVID era, not everybody's in the building every day. But still, it's very important that our colleagues work across these sectors, but we're all working to solve the same issues because we have a lot of insight. So, for instance, when an ed tech company comes in to pitch us on a new way to teach computer science, we say to Dr. Allison Scott, who's the CEO of Kapor Center, why don't you sit in on this pitch? Because after all, you at Kapor Center put out a national framework for culturally responsive computer science education. And so we've got these built in experts to give us insights into, well, is this really going to work? You're in the classroom every day with kids or all summer long or whatever context it is. Tell us, how are teachers going to respond to this? How are kids going to respond to this? How are parents going to respond to this? Would a school district ever buy this? So there is an awful lot of very practical synergy, and there's a lot of sort of ideological synergy, which is to think about, how can we do this in the best possible way to help as many people as possible?
Yeah.
And some of our for-profits, I mentioned Bitwise, they've also started their own .org, their own nonprofit, because they also see the need to be able to grant money or services or things. And so sometimes our foundation will work on projects. So, for instance, with Bitwise, right after the pandemic hit in 2020, um, it was a couple of dozen women of color who had been through the Bitwise apprenticeship program, who in 2 weeks stood up a dynamic website to help families and individuals impacted by COVID. You could go there for emergency services. We all lost our jobs. We're sick. We don't have any food. They'd bring you food. I need to go to my job, but I need childcare. My childcare provider, that went away with COVID. Okay, we'll help you with childcare. The second category was jobs. Here are jobs in your zip code around your skill set. So not something wild that you couldn't possibly do, and not something that you have to move across the country, but that kind of dynamism in making useful services available to people. And the third was then in the job training. So paid apprenticeships. So Bitwise pays you to go to school. And one of the brilliant things about Bitwise, and there's a Bitwise in Oakland, there are 4 Bitwise locations in California, and then they've scaled outside of California, Buffalo, Las Cruces, New Mexico, south side of Chicago, really interesting Toledo communities. But the key insight of Bitwise is it's not a lack of motivation. It's not a lack of talent that keeps people from getting upskilled. It's daily life gets in the way. I have a family to feed. I don't have transportation. I don't have childcare. How am I going to get to school? So they are paid apprenticeships that help you with transportation and with childcare. And guess what? 6 months later, when you had, that now that you've gone through the program, you gave up your minimum wage retail job or factory job, you've now doubled your salary. It's good for everybody. It contributes to the tax base. I mean, there's nobody who doesn't benefit from that kind of expanding the pie.
Yes, totally. Yeah. It's interesting too, because I feel like there's a, thinking about that, the like gap of, in the talent evenly distributed, but opportunity is not, and the kinds of things that keep people from, getting higher paying jobs, founding companies, whatever. How do you think about, and I think you have another good frame in your book around like, it's not about the distance traveled, it is about the distance traveled. It's not about the finish line, where when you're looking at someone, you're like, oh, wow, it's kind of like you started from the bottom, now you're here. And even if your here is slightly less than the like random us, like, I don't know, rich white guy like Rhys or whatever, it's like, oh my God, you're already like, he's like only a little bit above you, but like he essentially started there. So he hasn't really done anything his whole life. So like, how has that frame, kind of like the gap closing, gap widening frame, how has that frame helped you kind of find or kind of, I don't know, do talent search or like kind of understand the ecosystem?
But distance traveled is something that is very powerful and very meaningful to me. And I came up with it somewhere in the 2 decades ago frame. One of the things I did, I'm an alum of UC Berkeley as an undergrad. And after Proposition 209 passed, which was in, I think, 96 in California, outlawing affirmative action in public institutions. So the whole country right now is bracing for the Supreme Court decision in June, but those of us connected to public institutions in California have been dealing with this for 30 years, close to. And so after Prop 209 was passed, there were 4 of us who got together who were UC Berkeley alumni and wanted to do something meaningful. And we started a private scholarship program for kids who had been admitted race blind into Berkeley. So they got in under the new proposition, new law, new rules. And then we created a race conscious scholarship program to create a community so that they would feel that they were welcome on campus, since Prop 209 was such an exclusionary and unwelcoming kind of stance. And I learned a lot of things from that program about building that community. We replaced student loans, we replaced work study, we gave them laptops, we gave them tutoring, we helped them get summer jobs aligned with their field. And we just had amazing stars out of that program. And in fact, 3 of them work with us to this day, 20 years later. One is the co-managing partner of Kapor Capital. One is our senior head of comms and marketing, and one leads all of our tech policy efforts. So very talented people, very senior jobs. And it was understanding that a person who every day had to make a decision about whether I eat lunch and walk home 3, 4, 5 miles, or whether I take the bus and don't eat lunch. That people who had to figure out how to get where they got, how to better themselves, how to support their families with the most humble of resources, that those people had a determination, a resilience, a passion that all turn out to be wonderful predictors of talent and success, and to be essential qualities for an entrepreneur, because there are, as you well know, so many bumps in the road for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's great. It's like a I think of it as a similar thing when you're kind of, and I live with I live in a house that has 3 formerly incarcerated folks in it, former lifers, and you hear
Uh-huh.
about their just like their childhoods, and you're like, oh my god, that's brutal. And you also, I also kind of see myself, and then sometimes there's like, one of my housemates, he was just like a nerd kid, and then was bullied, and then that turned him more violent, or like, this other, one of my other housemates, he went and had he became homeless at the age of like 12 or whatever. And so it's like those, and now they're these amazing, aware individuals who are just like who are extremely productive and all these things that you would kind of expect to have normal people, but they've had to do this path, which is really, really intense. And so it's interesting because like, so I have a question then, which is so we have this ecosystem. Let's frame it as like there's all of this untapped market with folks who are with traditionally underserved folks, and there's all these really agentful young folks who just didn't have the opportunity initially, but actually are really agentic and can be great entrepreneurs or whatever. Why is it the case then that we still see something like, I don't know, I think it was like 13 or, Black folks are 13% of the population, but I think 1% of VC dollars go to Black entrepreneurs right now.
Mm-hmm.
So why is there still this like 10x gap if all this agency and all these good problems exist? Tell us about what's still stopping us from getting there or something. I'm not sure.
Well, I do think there is such a thing as systemic racism, and I don't know if people feel that, hear that and think that's just a buzzword or just, woke talk or whatever. But
it's like the clearest yes there. It's like, of course there's systemic racism, of course there's systemic sexism. It's like, oh my, yeah. So sorry, but yes,
you won't get many standard issue venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road to say that.
Uh-huh.
And so I think we have to figure out who the gatekeepers are and what they believe and how to talk to them. And so, for instance, I completely agree with what you said. There is all that talent out there. But, and I sometimes take issue, there are a lot of folks that say there is no pipeline problem. I respectfully disagree. I understand what they're saying. But if you look at who has access to computer science education, whether it's California or whether it's US wide, there is an enormous difference based on your zip code. And as you were pointing out, if you're homeless at 12, it has nothing to do with you. It is an accident of birth. It is, lucky, unlucky, where'd you fall in the birth lottery? And we tend to ascribe judgment to kids about the circumstances they were born into, which is truly nuts. But so if we look at the disparate access to computer science, we see that's the beginning of what we call the leaky tech pipeline, that where people fall out of the pipeline that get us to a 1% VC funding. So that's a piece of it, all these places that people fall out. Along the leaky tech pipeline are plenty of biases and barriers. So if you've got your algorithms on your hiring that are set to, I only want Ivy League schools in Stanford. I only want computer science degrees. I only want, it used to be a common refrain, I want a Stanford computer science graduate who worked at Google. Well, those aren't skills. Those are pedigrees, many of which are accidents of birth. So do you want a legacy admit and a nepotism hire? Exactly what are you going to get in terms of passion or drive or talent or skill? So I think we need to be a little less lazy in our hiring. And I think that's where distance traveled is a much better metric than pedigrees.
Yep, I love that. It makes me think there's a video from The Economist maybe 6 months to a year ago about a group in the UK that was specifically looking at distance hired, and they, instead of distance traveled, rather, where it's like, hey, here is, as a hiring thing, where you look at folks and that was the main metric in this whatever hiring dashboard was like, oh my god, this person's traveled so much distance. And so yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think, yeah, as you said, we still have a leaky tech pipeline. And so, yeah, it's always this balance of like, and I guess I have a more macro question. You were talking about, you've been doing this stuff for a while, and you, before the show, you and I were chatting about like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step sideways. Sometimes I feel excited by this stuff where I'm like, oh man, there's all these things, and look at all these, reading your book. It's like, oh, all these amazing entrepreneurs is doing great stuff, like kind of as you expect. This is great. And then and then you see the other side, and you're like, and the one that was brutal for me the other day was seeing in San Francisco the average incomes of different people by race. And white folks from 2010 to 2020, white folks went from $100,000 median income to $150,000. So they were like 1.5x. And then black folks started at 30,000. So they were already so much less. And then they just stayed at 30,000, and it was just like, I just looked at it, I was like, oh my God, this is in a progressive city, and so so I sometimes get sad too. So how do you navigate optimism and sadness? And, are we actually moving forward? Are we moving back? How are we doing?
Are we moving forward or back? Yes. We are moving, and every day, every week tends to bring an example of both. What I do find, and again, I'm an optimist. Who else would do this work for this many decades? Maybe a masochist, who knows? But I do remain an optimist, and I remain incredibly inspired every day by our entrepreneurs, by the entrepreneurs who pitch us, whether we end up backing them or not. But just the human creativity, and again, when we are known for diversity and impact, we disproportionately get to see people who absolutely are passionate about making the world a better place in one form or one dimension or another. So and part of why we wrote the book is to say, look, there are a lot of myths we need to dispel. There is a possibility to make substantive change on very difficult issues, and for people to make a lot of money along the way. And so why shouldn't more people dive in and try this?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like that. I think that, like, to just underscore that point for a second, it is from the perspective of a VC, it's, who's listening to this or who's reading the book or whatever, it's like, you can't help but be like, oh, okay, you can actually still make top quartile returns. In fact, it might be easier. Who knows? Maybe you guys are just like closing your eyes and, you're shooting fish in a barrel and those fish turn, but if you choose, just like, if you like kind of choose a good mark or have some kind of good frame on the world, this is one of those really good frames, which is that, oh man, there's a bunch of agentic folks and there's a lot of quote unquote arbitrage to be had with, supporting them in these markets that are traditionally unserved. So that's like to the VC that's listening or whatever. And then also to the founder that's listening, where it's like, you can just point at the all these awesome founders that are doing stuff. It's like, look, they had to do a lot of distance travel too, and they had to fight through all this kind of bullshit.
Yep.
But you can do it too. It's like there's a lot of folks that have, and you can as well. So do you think, how do you see, I guess, what are some of the most important things that need to happen in the next kind of 5 or 10 years to really kind of push this forward and to get it to be the case where it's like, yeah, I don't know, where they're closer to no gap?
Well, good question and an important question. I think we have to keep challenging the myths. So we have to challenge the myth with data and with case studies about investing with a diversity lens, investing with an impact lens is not concessionary. And as you said, it might even be a strategic advantage. I think we have to push back about the myth that if you went to a top school, you're therefore top talent. That I don't think the data would completely support that. I think we have to talk about the importance, certainly in the entrepreneurial world, the importance of lived experience. That the founder, having been through a key problem, is in the best position to describe the problem and invent the solution. And that's what gives them the passion. And we've got lots of great examples of that in the book. I think the other thing that needs to happen, very importantly, is consumers need to vote more with their pocketbook in terms of values alignment of the products and services and companies they support. I especially think And also similarly, employees need to vote with their feet more when they have a choice. Not everybody has the luxury of a choice about where to work, but if you have a choice, pick values alignment because you will be happier, you will be more productive. And it's important for companies to know how many people actually care. But a huge area that I think has not yet been tapped is I want everyone to think a little bit more about if you're lucky enough and you're fortunate enough to have a 401k, where is it invested? Who's investing it? What values, what investment criteria do they use? Would you be horrified if you knew where your retirement dollars are going to be sitting for decades and what companies they're going to be supporting? And why isn't there more of a push for investment alternatives that look at impact and look at diversity?
Interesting. Yeah, got it. And I think so. Let's double click on that one for a second, because I think the difficult part of it is that it might get into the the more muddy overall ESG category or whatever.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so, let's say I'm a person who, in fact, I am a person who has a 401k. And I remember looking. I was like, okay, should I put this in the ESG thingy or from Vanguard, or should I put it in this other thingy? I remember when I was like 17 and did my first like investing, as a privileged child, I put it into green companies, right, as the clean tech. I don't know. So I don't know. So is there a is that is it worth it to like put to invest your 401k in like ESG stocks, or tell us more about that?
Well, it's a very important question. ESG, environmental social governance, is a set of criteria that actually grew out of the United Nations Development Goals, sustainability goals decades ago. It has become very blurry. It is not clear. And in the same way, impact means anything and everything to everybody these days. And that's true on ESG. It has become a lot of performative nonsense in many cases. As my husband Mitch likes to say, same thing with B Corp. If you have enough recycling baskets, you can earn enough points, and it doesn't matter that you actually invest in fossil fuels. It's so you have to dig deeply on what does it really mean. But for us, using very clear investment criteria about gap closing, we know who benefits. We know that 60% of our founders are underrepresented. We know who's benefiting from their businesses, and we know that we're getting top quartile returns. So unfortunately, things are, we've got a lot of nonsense marketing, but that's not new. And we have to wade through nonsense marketing to decide what food to eat. And so we're going to have to wade through some nonsense marketing to decide where we invest. But I would hope that there would become much more rigorous and much more available real gap closing, impact, diversity lens investment options.
Yep. I agree with that. And I think in the folks that are, anti ESG or whatever, it's like, that's true. But like, I think it's good that we're at the beginning of the ESG framework. We're at the beginning of B Corps. We're at the beginning, Etsy had to file their B Corp, with the SEC thing of like hey, here's how our double bottom line actually worked this last year. And blah. So I think, we're just at the beginning of these things and still trying to, help create and be values aligned and do the right thing with your money. Seems good. So I have a question actually for you, which is this we've been talking a lot about the investing side. But I did some Googling before, but correct me if I'm wrong. Are you stepping back from investing? Is that true? And if so, what are you doing?
Good question and great story. So Mitch and I, as founders of Kapor Capital in 2011, have stepped back. We are now the largest limited partners in Kapor Capital 3. We are not the general partners making investment decisions. The general partners are Ulili Anavakpuri and Brian Dixon. They are the co-managing partners who have been with us for more than a decade each. Ulili is somebody who I actually met in that Berkeley Scholarship Program. And so she started on the nonprofit side, migrated to venture capital, went to business school, went to another firm, and luckily we got her back. But in 2011, Ulili, partly based on her experience in our scholarship program at Berkeley, came to me and said, "Can I start a summer associates program to open a door for people who don't know what venture capital is to have an opportunity to check it out?" And I thought that was just a brilliant idea. And so we said, sure. So the first summer associate she hired was Brian Dixon. The fact that they are now the two co-managing partners, I mean, it just warms my heart. It's the contemporary mailroom to CEO story on the investment world. And, they've been with us a long time. They are fabulous human beings. They are terrific investors. They've been partners. Each of them has been partners for many years, at least 5 years. And year by year, they each led more and more deals. And so it was just a wonderful thing to be able to hand over the reins. So we're still involved as LPs. Mitch and I still do investing out of the foundation endowment, but that's at a smaller scale. And we're investing in funds, in new funds, mostly by underestimated first-time fund managers.
Distance traveled people.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And so you've kind of, I guess, are you retiring, or I don't know, it's like you had a job, like my simple guys, like you had a job here and now are you just, LPing into funds, or what's your day to day,
A little of all of the above. I would say we are on a glide path of stepping back.
Cool.
We're still pretty far away from retiring altogether. And there were many things that were happening under the Kapor Capital umbrella that have now moved over to Kapor Center now that Brian and Ulili have limited partners. Cool. And so they have to, they're under a lot of scrutiny, living within their management fees, all that stuff. And so the things that we used to be able to do, like start the Summer Associates program, we've moved it over to Kapor Center and have grown it.
Cool.
Because we want to make it available to not just to Kapor Capital. We want to make Summer Fellows available to other smaller venture capital firms.
Yeah, love it. Got it. And yeah, so and I get the vibe of, it's not, one doesn't 1 to 0 go from working every day to retirement. It's, you guys are doing this thing where you're vibing more, you're kind of taking a slow, the decade long step back. So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. Well, we've got this amazing leadership. So Brian and Ulili have been with us for well over a decade. Allison Scott, who's the CEO of Kapor Center, who I mentioned, has been with us at least a dozen years. So we've got this wonderful talent, and we might as well get out of their way and let them lead, right?
Squad, yeah, you'd let the squad it up. Beautiful. So as we get into wrap mode here, let me ask one final question, then do an overrated, underrated thing. So the question is, what advice do you have for ambitious young folks who are, ambitious young, just what advice do you have for ambitious young people?
Well, for ambitious young people, my advice is pursue your passion, pursue what matters. Think about the difference you want to make in the world. Think about what's going to help you sleep at night, about the choices that you make. Everybody has to make choices about supporting themselves, maybe contributing, helping support parents, siblings, others. So everybody has to make their own choices on that basis. But look for values alignment whenever and wherever you can, because it's an awful experience to show up at a job you hate, to show up at a job where you feel you check yourself at the door every day, to show up and feel like you're contributing to something that is making the world a worse place.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like that. I think it's like, you can do that for 6 months, or sometimes people even do it for 6 years or 60 years. But hopefully you can really check in with yourself and be like, am I actually doing things that are aligned with me? Great. Mm-hmm. So we're going to wrap up with this thing called overrated, underrated. I'm going to say a thing, and then you'll say whether you think it's overrated or underrated, and give one sentence on why. And so the first thing is filling the pipeline with marginalized STEM talent, is that overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
And why?
It has not been understood enough about what we're doing is we're removing unfair barriers that never should have been there in the first place.
Yeah, cool. Beautiful. What about tech's ability to democratize access to wealth? Is that overrated or underrated?
Uh, it's overrated in terms of how it's practiced, and it is underrated in trying out new models.
Yeah, I like that. It's like, oh wow, we can democratize access to everything. It's like, wait a second, is this? Aren't these the same people that had power in the past? Yeah. Okay, great. This one's kind of a weird overrated, underrated, and it's almost like putting up a false binary that I think might be difficult, but I want to ask anyway. So it's like, what do you think? You could either say it as overrated, underrated, or like which one's a bigger problem, quote unquote. Is it the problem that women have in tech, or the problem that like kind of like racial, like BIPOC groups have in tech? Which one is like bigger?
Well, so first of all, I always take an intersectional look.
Yeah.
And so we have BIPOC women who are, suffering the most abuse and exclusion and
yeah.
unfair
They got them both,
treatment.
Yeah.
So I think that's my answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, got it. Yeah, that there's okay, great. I'm fine with that. Well, let me push you. Do you think for that, that BIPOC woman does she experience more kind of crap from society as she's trying to build a company because of her womanness or because of her BIPOCness or blackness or whatever?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think I've heard many Black women, many Latinx women talk about their inability to disaggregate that. That when they walk in a room and they're ignored, or they walk in a room and they're doubted, they actually don't know which it is. Sometimes there's an overtly racialized or sexualized comment or question that gives a hint, but sometimes they just know that they're not being taken seriously and they don't know why.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm fine with that. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Freada, for coming on the show. For
My
folks
pleasure.
who want to, and folks who want to check out Freada on Twitter, she is The Real Freada. That's TheReal and then Freada. You can also check out the book, closingtheequitygap.com. It's just a cool book to understand just a bunch of cool stories of just like founders doing cool stuff. And so check that out. And then also if you want to, collaborate with them, work with them, do whatever, be an entrepreneur that wants to go through the stuff, check out kaporcapital.com. That's Kapor, kaporcapital.com, KAPOR, Anything else you want to say, Freada, for our listeners today?
No. Well, thank you for your interest in what we do and your enthusiasm for it. And I hope to see lots more gap closing companies.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for all that you do as well. And thanks for listening, everybody. Goodbye, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening today. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.